introduce our next session, we are really happy to have Michael Clune with us. He is the Samuel B. and Virginia C. Knight Professor of Humanities at Case Western Reserve. The titles of his academic books include Writing Against Time, American Literature and the Free Market, and maybe most relevant to this conference, the recently released A Defense of Judgment, which makes the case for frankly acknowledging literary studies as an exercise in aesthetic education, complete with judgments about better and worse. He also writes creatively, including Game Life and Whiteout, which The New Yorker and others too named a best book of 2013. And commenting on Professor Clune's talk will be Benjamin Barasch, a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer here at Yale in the Humanities program. And I want to say again, one of the principal inspirations for and organizers of this conference. His book project is titled Living Thought, Form, and Vitality in American Literature. And a paper of his, Emerson's Discovery of Life, was the 2019 winner of the Ralph Waldo Emerson Society's award for the best graduate student paper. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Clune. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm gonna share a screen here. Let me see. Okay, can everyone see that? All right, great. All right. In a chapter of his 1970 book, The Omni-Americans, Albert Murray articulates a strongly negative judgment about Claude Brown's thinly fictionalized autobiographical Man-Child in the Promised Land, published in 1965. Murray reads the work in the context of its celebration by white intellectuals and media as a vivid documentary depiction of what life is really like in the Black inner city. The terms of Murray's rejection of man-child, echoed by other prominent Black intellectuals in the early 1970s, perhaps accounts for the curious fact that almost no secondary literature has been devoted to Brown's book in the past half-century. Murray describes man-child as autobiographical social science fiction. This derisive term expresses his sense that far from representing the unmediated reality of mid-century Black life, Brown's work recycles the favorite theses of white social scientists about the pathologies of the inner city. Being Black is not enough to make anybody an authority on US Negroes any more than being white has ever qualified anybody as an expert on the ways of US white people. In order to discover within one's individual experience truths with the potential to illuminate aspects of the Black condition, one requires skills and insights that Brown lacks. And this is a quote by Albert Murray. Perhaps one of the most significant things this book, Man-Child in the Promised Land, actually reveals is how difficult it is to be a serious writer when you've been interviewed, advised, rehabilitated, and structured by social workers, liberals, and other do-gooders year after year. Brown's book recounts how he passes through various levels of the justice and welfare systems, at each stage exposed to the viewpoint of the reigning social science. Murray believes that Brown has internalized that perspective. The spectacular popular success of Brown's account of his violent upbringing in post-war Harlem depends on its reinforcement of a view of Black urban violence that white social science has already implanted in the minds of white readers. Far from being a documentary slice of raw life, Brown's book describes a closed loop cut off from insightful contact with Black reality, recycling the preconceptions of the white professional classes. For Murray, Brown's book is part of the fake lore of Black pathology. Brown's depictions of intra-Black violence exists in a context in which the legacy of white supremacy has deprived Black people of basic rights and protections. Images of the violent Black inner city apparently function to awaken moral indignation and calls for reform. But in fact, these negative images don't expose so much as advance the aims of white supremacy. These creatures, the logic-tight cycle begins, being non-white, the negative of white, are less than white, and being less than white are less than normal as human beings and therefore exploitable, and having been rendered even less human as a result of exploitation are thus further exploitable because less than human, and so on. Thus, Murray argues that Man-Child in the Promised Land, with its many scenes of intense violence committed by and to Blacks, gratifies a middle-class white audience, which conceals its titillation at the stabbings and shootings with a pretense of moral offense. 50 years after Murray's book, his analysis is likely to strike us as resonating with the critique of rap music, which in the wake of Dr. Dre's epical 1992 album, The Chronic, increasingly focuses on depictions of inner city violence. The prominent Black sociologist Orlando Patterson's deep and nuanced analysis of rap culture reveals the extent to which Murray's critique of the social science of race has been adopted by many of its most advanced practitioners, even as Murray's judgment of Claude Brown is echoed by Patterson's judgment of rap. In his 2015 book, The Cultural Matrix, Patterson focuses on what he calls one of the central and here's the slide, there's a slide here, this quote. One of the central paradoxes of American civilization, the near complete socioeconomic isolation of disadvantaged Black youth from middle-class American mainstream culture and from its most critical procedural knowledge base, in conjunction with the complete integration and constitutive role of Black youth in its popular culture, to the degree that the very identity of this culture in America and the world is in a good part recognized as Black. Inner city Black youth are socially marginal and culturally central. Patterson approaches this paradox by acknowledging the extraordinary creativity of rap. Black hip hop culture has redefined the mainstream. He offers an original analysis of the link between creativity and rap's ethos of respect, describing the glorification of self-esteem and near manic claim and defense of respect for its own sake. In Nietzschean terms, this is the engine of creativity, as he proclaims, and thus spoke Zarathustra, to esteem is to create, through esteeming alone there is value. But as Patterson's analysis proceeds, the paradox of the simultaneous centrality and marginality of the Black inner city is displaced by another paradox. Why does the most powerful contemporary manifestation of Black artistic creativity center so intractably on celebrations of Black violence? He argues that the answer to this paradox is that the Dionysian power of Black violence is esteemed by white culture. White office-dwelling workaholics listen to rap to unwind. Profit-seeking corporations package rap to appeal to white tastes, thereby incentivizing the Black inner city to create more of it. Patterson quotes Trisha Rose to show how white fans feed off images abstracted from the reality of Black pain. Where's the fun in actually living in the kind of environment in which street-level drug dealers, street prostitutes, and pimps ply their trade? Instead of this grim reality, hip-hop gives far-flung fans, many of whom populate relatively comfortable and non-Black environments, entertainment without suffering. Thus, Patterson's analysis of hip-hop's valorization of violence replicates Murray's analysis of violence in Claude Brown. Images of the chaotic Black inner city function in an economy determined by the white demand for the performance of Black degradation. Just as Murray suggests that Claude Brown's personal fame and fortune come at the expense of the Black suffering his images help perpetuate, Patterson notes that only a small minority of Black youth reap financial success and renown from their creativity. While Patterson's data does not support causal accounts that make Black representations of inner city violence responsible for that violence, he does describe rap's celebration of violence as evil. Rap is evil in exerting a dangerous attraction for Black youth, a dangerous fascination for whites, and an erasure of the majority of the Black inhabitants of the inner city who don't participate in the culture of guns and drugs it depicts. Today, I want to open up the question of the value of violence in Black art by returning to Man-Child in the Promised Land. I believe Brown's book has been fundamentally misread by both its celebrators and detractors who see it as exemplary. Positive contemporary white reviewers like Tom Wolfe understood Man-Child as exemplifying the violence of the Black inner city. Black writers like Murray and Ishmael Reed saw it as exemplifying the fake lore of Black pathology. Yet I will argue that what the book actually documents is the development by Brown of a form of judgment that selects among the variety of the violences of his environment and judges one form to constitute the primary aesthetic goal of Black inner city creativity. Just as Frederick Douglass's autobiography doesn't simply document the songs of the enslaved, but creates a critical frame and articulates criteria by which they should be perceived and judged, so Claude Brown doesn't naively transmit the social forms of his environment, but discerns in those forms an aesthetic shape that will come to dominate large swaths of the culture of America and the world. Furthermore, this judgment, far from reproducing the values of the middle-class world, is determined by a rigorous effort to evolve purely immanent criteria of value. Man-Child in the Promised Land represents three primary forms of violence. The first is the violence of his youth in the streets of Harlem and the halls of reform schools. The second is the violence he witnesses during an extended trip to family in the Deep South. And the third is the violence associated with the heroin epidemic. The first of these is the only form he invests with value. Let's look at three passages in which he describes its significance. If anyone had asked me around the latter part of 1957 just what I thought had made the greatest impression on my generation in Harlem, I would have said drugs. In 1949, I would have answered that same question with the answer, the knife. Perhaps all this could have been summed up in saying, the bad motherfucker. Throughout my childhood in Harlem, nothing was more strongly impressed upon me than the fact that you had to fight and that you should fight. Everybody respected people for fighting. It went deep. It went very deep until drugs came. Fighting was the thing that people concentrated on. In our childhood, we all had to make our reputations in the neighborhood. Then we'd spend the rest of our lives living up to them. A man was respected on the basis of his reputation. The little boys in the neighborhood whom the adults respected were the little boys who didn't let anybody mess with them. It was the fighting and the stealing that made me somebody. If I hadn't fought or stolen, I would have been just another kid on the street. The violence of Brown's boyhood essentially functions in the way violence works in epic traditions, such as that represented by the Iliad. Success in combat confers identity and respect. The primary goal of fighting is fame. The one who risks himself by fighting does so in pursuit of glory, reputation, and name. The scene of battle consists of a background of gangs or groups bound by loyalty and sacrifice, and a foreground of two individual combatants trying their skill and courage against each other. The characteristic epic choice between a long, safe, anonymous life and a short, violent, glorious one is thematized by Brown in the constant invidious distinctions between those who fail to break free from the domestic space, who lack the courage to risk themselves in fighting. This is not an egalitarian ethos. Many will be too weak or cowardly to win. Many more will be wounded or die. Only a few will attain glory. But participation in fighting culture is open to anyone, even women. And the spectacle is available to all those who watch the street, enabling vicarious participation in the struggle. These observers don't simply relish the violence from a position of passivity and safety. Like the older men Brown depicts who observe the boys fighting, they apply the criteria of courage and style, and they secure the winner's reputation. The streets of Harlem in the 1940s, as Brown represents them, define a special kind of social space, a sphere in which through direct violent struggle, one can attain high distinction. Perhaps the majority of people of all classes and races in all times never enter such a sphere except in stories, music, or film. It is important not to confuse the book's many representations of the pain caused by violence, such as the book's opening pages, which show Claude just having been shot, with a qualification of the value of street fighting. Rather, the reverse is true. The representation of the pain of being wounded or defeated is an adjunct of the praise of violence, in part through a familiar Lucretian logic whereby the shortness of life invests it with beauty. I remember Johnny saying that the only thing in life a bad motherfucker was scared of was living too long. As we shall see, the important distinction in the book is not between life and death or ease and pain, but between pain that confers distinction, meaning, and identity, and pain that is empty. If man-child in the Promised Land had followed the trajectory of contemporary social scientific folklore, or if it followed the trajectory of Claude Brown's actual career, it would have depicted a movement from immersion in violence and its street values to the redeemed, educated values of the adult writer. But in fact, the book ends with a paean to the violence of Brown's youth. Here are the book's final paragraphs. To me, home was on the street. I suppose there were many people who felt that. If home was so miserable, the street was the place to be. I wonder if mine was really so miserable, or if it was that there was so much happening on the street that it made home seem such a dull and dismal place. When I was very young, about 5 years old, maybe younger, I would always be sitting out on the stoop. I never wanted to go inside because there was so much out there in that street. You might see somebody get cut or killed. I could go out in the street for an afternoon and I would see so much that when I came in the house, I'd be talking and talking for what seemed like hours. Dad would say, "Boy, why don't you stop that lying? You know you didn't see all that. You know you didn't see nobody do that." But I knew I had. I want to highlight 3 features of this ending. First, and contra Murray, the ending shatters the value systems the various psychologists and social workers offer Claude. By simply presenting these these early scenes of violence without a shred of regret, without any qualification, without the reflection that he wishes others could be spared his violent early years, Brown ignores the most basic values of the social workers. He underlines this rejection when he casts doubt on the standard contemporary psychological explanation for his interest in violence, his abusive home life. His home life is indeed characterized by repeated beatings from his fathers. But as we shall see, Brown distinguishes sharply between domestic violence and the violence of the streets. Here he suggests that it isn't the lessons of the former, but the internal intrinsic value of the latter that drew him to fighting. The second notable aspect of the ending is the way the encounter between his father and himself in the final lines models the relation between Brown and his readers, founding it on the fascinating spectacle of street violence. This, he suggests, is what he has ultimately shown his audience. This is why the book is worth reading. The preceding 400 pages constitute an elucidation and a defense of the value of 1940s street violence, framing its repeated representations. His father resists his story, not on moral grounds, but because it sounds too good, too fantastic, too fascinating to be true. For his father, the value of such a story, if it is real, can't be contested. It is obviously good, obviously interesting. Everyone will find it compelling. The resistance of Claude's father to his story is precisely that of someone who finds it hard to believe that the dynamics associated with such distant realms as the Wild West film have been incarnated in the experience of a living person. The final feature of this passage I want to highlight is that the violence with which the book ends is not, in fact, the violence that characterizes the Harlem of 1965 when the book was published, or even 1955. It belongs to a bygone era. The book functions to rescue this particular lost form of violence from its wreck in the history of the 50s and 60s. The ending of the book is preceded, as we shall see, by Brown's effort to discover a way of representing contemporary violence that conserves something of the fundamental dynamics of 1940s violence. I will argue that this effort involves the most complex and morally ambiguous, as well as the most culturally prophetic dimension of Brown's achievements. But what I want to emphasize now is that what fascinates, what compels, is not the kind of violence both the book's lovers and haters in the war on crime era 60s and 70s have in mind. Both Murray and the pathologizing perspective he rejects collapse the book's varied scenes of violence, seeing an essential continuity between the 40s and 60s. Yet much of Brown's work involves carefully distinguishing among these forms. That these distinctions remain so invisible to so careful a reader as Murray is one index of their anomaly, their novelty in contemporaneous discussions of race and violence. The value of 40s street fighting is defined by contrast with forms of violence without the capacity to establish a name, and with forms of pain and wounding that are empty and without value. The book is as intense and rigorous in its condemnation of these empty forms of violence as it is in praising the violence that endows life with meaning. The first contrast is with the violence he encounters during the year he spends in the Deep South with his grandparents. The South is distinct from Harlem in several ways, perhaps most significantly through the presence and visibility of white people. Before he leaves, his little brother asks him a question. "They got crackers down there, ain't they, Sonny?" Sonny is the narrator's nickname in his family. "Yeah, Mama said they got crackers down south." "Sonny, what is crackers?" "The crackers down south is white people, real mean white people." "Is Mr. Goldman a cracker, Sonny?" "No, he's a Jew." This exchange reveals first the extent to which in Harlem, as a segregated northern urban space, Claude and his family encounter very few non-Blacks. The tradespeople they do encounter tend to be Jews who are, in mid-century America, distinguished from whites. Members of Claude's social milieu don't spend much time thinking about how whites might view them. Once he arrives in the South, however, he enters a space defined by white surveillance, a space of enforced Black servility where he learns he must say yassa and yes'm. While he doesn't represent any encounters with whites, the place is electrified by their spectral presence. Brown's grandmother views the white of potato flesh through a racial lens. Whiteness manifests as a constant threatening gaze. Brown presents the social characteristics of the South through a string of violent incidents. This violence consists of two kinds, which his prose brings into close and unexpected relation. The first is domestic violence, such as when both his grandmother and grandfather beat him. The second involves violence against animals. "Grandpa was an evil man. The time I hated him most and shouldn't have was that hog killing time when I hit the hog on the head with an axe. The hog didn't die. Grandpa said, 'Boy, you ain't shit.' I wanted to hit him in the head with that axe, but I was scared of what would happen if he didn't die." After his grandmother beats him for no reason he can grasp, he describes her mouth as being like a monkey's. In another scene, Brown makes the link between Southern violence and animality even more explicit. "One day I saw Grandma kill a rattlesnake with a hoe. She chopped the snake's head off in the front yard, and I sat on the porch and watched the snake's body keep wriggling till it was nighttime. And I saw an old brown hound dog named Old Joe eat a rat one day right out in the front yard. He ate something that looked like the yellow part in an egg, and I didn't eat eggs for a long time after that." Violence in Harlem is humanizing. It gives you a name, makes you a man. Violence in the South, by contrast, degrades people to the level of animals. The exploitation and degradation of Blacks in the Jim Crow South becomes salient to Brown in this link between violence and animality. Condemned by the South's racial economic order to subsistence farming, for Brown's Southern family, labor consists of violence directed toward animals. The labor of violence is part of the exploited labor of the sharecropper. This labor doesn't so much distinguish the worker as involve him more deeply in a situation of servitude and anonymity. And of course, in the background of these scenes in which violence against animals becomes a means of dehumanizing Black people, lie the traditions and practices of Southern white supremacy. Perhaps the closest analog the South offers to the glory possible in Harlem street fighting culture is the figure of the violent bad man. Yet Claude finds the examples of such men he encounters to be repulsive. He meets an old man who has one eye and one hand. He's told that this is someone who didn't take no shit from nobody, not even from the crackers. But the old man's mutilation registers quite differently from the battle scars displayed in Harlem. It's as if the social background of the South isn't tuned to transmit glory. When Claude goes to the funeral of another bad man, he writes, "They said he was a real big man, but he was lying down when I saw him. And they said he was so mean, he looked like the devil, but his eyes were closed when I saw him and he just looked dead to me." In part, the problem is that the South lacks the aesthetic forms adequate to memorializing and celebrating humanizing violence. The church, where the service for the bad man is held, represents the wrong value system for celebrating human glory. This dismissal of Christianity is one instance of the book's persistent assault on religion. Claude views the religiosity of Harlem as one of the most pernicious survivals from the countryside. Thinking of the funeral he observes down south, he writes, "I couldn't understand why they sang nothing but those sad old church songs. They sure seemed to be some dumb country people to me. They didn't know any boogie songs or jump songs. They didn't even know any good blues songs. Nobody had a record player and nobody had records. All the songs they sang, they'd been singing for years and years." If the Southern dumb church songs represent an inadequate aesthetic form, the paragraph in which Brown describes his return from the South offers an example of a superior form. It was Sunday morning. Kids were coming from church with their mothers and fathers, and some people were sick and vomiting in the street. Most of the people were dressed up, and vomit was all over the street near the beer gardens. There was a lot of blood near the beer gardens and all over the sidewalk on 8th Avenue. This was a real Sunday morning. A lot of blood and vomit everywhere, and people all dressed up and going to church. It was all real good to see again, real good. There were ladies going to church in white dresses and trying real hard not to look at the men standing on the corners, cussing and saying fresh things to them, but trying real hard to listen. I was so happy to see them, to see it all, to see Harlem again. The word real, which multiplies throughout this paragraph, signifies here, as it will in hip hop culture, not simply documentary realism, but an aesthetic value. Real functions in terms of an opposition to the ideal. The ideal violated by the real in this passage is, in one sense, the ideal of the Christian South, with its demands for surface propriety and its intense religiosity. On this real Sunday morning, unlike the Sunday mornings in the South, the church atmosphere is completely overtaken by street dynamics. In the South, the sad old church songs eliminate the meaningfulness of human violence, submerging it in the undifferentiated suffering of an oppressed condition. Here, the opposite movement occurs. The church becomes a stage for the display of street values. The blood that runs in the streets is neither the blood of Christ nor the blood of animals. It is human blood, a substance that offers a real redemption. This blood takes anonymous people and gives them names. It takes empty pain and replaces it with transfigured, meaningful pain. If the humanistic form of violence Brown values is set off on one side by the animalistic violence of the Jim Crow South, it is set off on the other side by the violence associated with the spread of heroin addiction in Harlem in the 1950s. Heroin had just about taken over Harlem. It seemed to be a kind of plague. You'd ask about an old friend and they'd say, "Oh, well, he's strung out." It wasn't just a comment or an answer to a question. It was a eulogy for someone. He was just dead through. At that time, I didn't know anybody who had kicked it. Heroin had been a thing in Harlem for about 5 years, and I don't think anybody knew anyone who had kicked it. I was afraid to ask about somebody I hadn't seen in a while, especially if he was somebody who was once a good friend of mine. There was always a chance someone would say, "Well, he died. The cat took an OD, or he was pushed off a window trying to rob somebody's apartment, or shot 5 times trying to stick up a place to get some money for drugs." Cats were starving for drugs. Their habit was down on them, and they were getting sick. They were out of their minds, so money for drugs became the big thing. Like the bad man at the funeral, the junkies' violence is empty. Their pain is a nullity. They're just dead. The drug culture displaces the fighting culture. Whereas violence was once pursued in a quest for reputation and glory, now violence is driven by the bottomless need of the addict for the drug. In an astonishing passage, Brown formulates the displacement of fighting by drugs through an image of blood. He has encountered another old friend, Ruby, who has succumbed to the plague. He gives her $5 to buy some drugs so she won't have to turn a trick, and then he watches her prepare the syringe. I watched the syringe as the blood came up into the drugs that seemed like dirty water. It just filled up with blood. And as the blood and the drugs started its way down the needle, I thought, this is our childhood. Our childhood had been covered with blood as the drugs had been, covered with blood and gone down into somewhere. I wondered where. Read against the backdrop of Claude's mourning for the vanished fighting culture of his earlier years, this complex image of blood polluted by the dirty water of drugs expresses the debasement of violence by the drug epidemic. But the image contains several other levels of meaning. If the drugs cover the blood in the first half of the passage, in the latter half, both the drugs and the childhood are covered with blood. If the first part of the image's development suggests an asymmetry between the fighting of Brown's childhood and the heroin plague of his late adolescence, the second part forges a symmetry. His childhood, both damaged and electrified by violence, covered with blood, had been rendered unrecognizable in terms of an ideal middle-class childhood. Drugs damaged the life of Harlem in a new but comparable way, rendering it even more distant from any imaginable ideal. Yet the last two sentences, evocation of disappearance, lends a third significance to the image. Covered with blood and gone down into somewhere, I wondered where. Brown's book is, as I've attempted to show, largely the effort to memorialize, to rescue the ethos of Harlem fighting culture through the aesthetic shape of his sentences. This project is haunted by death, mere death, inglorious, anonymous, mute death, and by disappearance, forgetfulness. The book's culminating sequence, the chapter before the final paragraphs celebrating the violence of his youth, consists of an effort to grasp the form of a humanizing violence's survival through the drug culture. It is an effort to counter the total erasure glimpsed in Ruby's heroin syringe by saving drug culture through the aesthetic resources of fighting culture. By the end of the book, Claude has moved out of Harlem, alienated by the random, senseless violence of the heroin plague. His mother is stabbed by junkies who break into the house. His younger brother falls victim to addiction. The final chapter begins with him thinking of two of his friends who survived. One, Danny, had been a legendary street fighter before becoming an addict. But he freed himself of heroin and now makes a living dealing drugs. The other friend, Turk, channeled his fighting prowess into a career as a prize fighter. There's a third survivor, of course, Claude Brown himself, who attains fame by writing about fighting. I haven't seen Danny lately, but I've seen so many other people in Harlem. Most of the junkies around there now are young cats. They're younger than Danny and younger than me. I wish I could get out in Harlem in a truck with a loudspeaker on it, like the politicians do around election time, and just tell the story of Danny to some of the cats out there on the streets nodding and scratching. And maybe tell the story of Turk, the stuff he came through and the achievements he made despite it all. I'd like to show them that despite everything that Harlem did to our generation, I think it gave something to a few. It gave them a strength that couldn't be obtained anywhere else. The passage ends with an emphatic and extraordinary affirmation that the struggle through which these figures have passed does not consist of empty pain. The violence they've suffered and inflicted in the Black inner city endows them with a power that can't be discovered anywhere else. 3 decades later, the truth of Brown's affirmation will be manifest as images of Black violence and Black survival first transform and then dominate the culture of the United States and the world. The key to that survival lies in the first figure Brown wants to proclaim on a loudspeaker. Brown himself and Turk remained apart from the drug culture. They found ways to preserve the achievements of the fighting culture in its relative purity. But Danny is different. He passes through the drug culture, first as an addict, then as a dealer. The figure of the strong, violent drug dealer will enter rap in the mid-1980s, achieving ubiquity and dominance by the mid-1990s, and continuing in dominance through the present in the lyrics of rappers like Young Thug, Little Baby, 21 Savage, or Pop Smoke. This figure will revel in the form of violence Brown associates with the era prior to the drug epidemic, achieving dominance and fame through the depiction of exhilarating me versus you struggles. But the experience of addiction is largely erased from these depictions. Brown's sense of the deep incompatibility of the humanizing violence of fighting culture and the addictive logic of drug culture is prophetic here too. Very few successful rappers, DMX, BG, and Soulja Slim are prominent among these few, describe their struggles with addiction, and all but DMX place those struggles firmly in the past. It is notable also that DMX rarely represents himself as a drug dealer and evokes explicitly Christian themes in his rap at a scale rare in the genre. Here we see the tension that critics of rap like Trisha Rose or Orlando Patterson discover in the contrast between rap's celebration of certain aspects of street actuality while repressing other aspects. The pain of addiction is, in Brown's term, empty. It can be redeemed in discourses such as those of the recovery world, which is inflected by egalitarian and Christian ideals. But it seems to be assimilable by the ethos Brown celebrates only on something like the terms offered by Danny. The addict becomes the dealer, the slave becomes the master, the dominated becomes the dominant. A serious question posed by Manchild's ending lies in the difference between Danny on the one hand and Turk and Claude himself on the other. All of their cases are marked by the anti-egalitarian, aristocratic ethos intrinsic to fighting culture. Those who survive will be stronger than anyone else. They will be made stronger than any other arena, any other environment could make them. The many who fail, who fall by the wayside, are, like the pain suffered by the victors, the necessary adjunct of the process of forging the strongest. But Danny bears a different relation to the fallen. As a drug dealer, he doesn't just overcome obstacles and beat opponents in a way that others cannot. He exploits the weakness of others. He profits from their misery. Brown is able to discover an analog to the heroes of epic fighting culture in drug culture only by introducing a tension that threatens to undermine the aesthetic order he erects. Does Claude's own success or the success of future rappers also partake in the exploitation figured in Danny? From an egalitarian or Christian perspective, the difference between the hero who beats all opponents to emerge victorious and the dealer who corners a drug market through violence and cunning may appear small. But from the perspective of the system of values Brown evolves, that difference is crucial. It's the difference between a scenario in which I prove my strength by beating you and showing your weakness versus a scenario in which I become strong through the disease that makes you weak. In the latter scenario, my strength is simply the other side of your weakness. It is bound to it, dependent on it. Without junkies, the dealer is nothing. The street fighter proves his strength on the weak. The dealer attains his strength through the weak. Modern rap will largely avoid this problem, presenting the figure of the drug dealer without representing addiction. Brown, however, exposes this tension. I want to conclude by passing from the tensions in the system of values, tensions which have, after all, been perceptively explored by writers like Rose and Patterson, to the less frequently analyzed question of its formation. What is remarkable is the extent to which Brown's criteria of value are evolved through the rigorous requirement that they be immanent to the Black inner city. It is difficult to imagine social workers who would wish to drive through Harlem with a loudspeaker, telling Danny's story in order to inspire hope in the youth. Brown confronts and expels as alien a variety of value systems, from Christianity and Black Islam to revolutionary militancy. In this, he also anticipates the dynamics of rap. From the NWA era to the present, there's been a tension between the socially conscious lyrics favored by middle-class intellectuals and the violent gangster aesthetic, which has often rejected social justice themes as not real. The values of the street fighting culture of his youth strike Brown as real, in the sense of repelling various idealizing discourses. The humanizing blood of street combat is anathema to the Pacific code of Christianity, to the dogma of social workers, and to 60s militancy, which subordinates violence to politics. Brown depicts these discourses as invading Harlem from the outside, whether from the world of the Deep South or of the university. It is in his commitment to immanence, to values discovered within the matrix of working class Harlem society itself, that the spiritual ethos of Brown's book is most apparent. The first half of the book describes the slow maturing of this commitment to immanence, the seed of which is paradoxically planted by a social worker, albeit in a manner quite different from that imagined by Albert Murray. What the social worker teaches him, Brown reflects, is acceptance. He slowly learns to see everybody as they really are, beneath the various ideals projected onto people in Harlem by the media, the welfare apparatus, the justice system, the memories of the South, the church. The most striking example of this acceptance occurs when a friend tells Claude that he plans to marry a woman who works as a prostitute. Claude makes fun of his friend for this. The friend grows angry, saying that he loves her and doesn't care what anyone else thinks. This strikes Claude with the force of revelation. We see the other side of this revelation in the painstaking way Brown discovers and projects Harlem's own way of loving its children in his preservation of the means by which it takes the anonymous and despised and gives them a strength not possible anywhere else, a strength with which the world will come to acknowledge in the coming decades. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. I want to discuss Michael Clune's fascinating thoughts on value in Claude Brown by putting them in conversation with his new book, A Defense of Judgment. The book fits perfectly with this conference. It's a forceful argument for the centrality of value judgments in teaching and writing about the arts. Clune makes a compelling case for why judgment is necessary and shows what it can look like in practice. I see today's talk as a further exemplification of his practice of judgment, so I'll use the talk as a way into some broader questions the book raised for me that I think are particularly relevant to the conference. In A Defense of Judgment, Clune argues that professors of literature and the arts generally are paralyzed by misplaced egalitarianism. We think that in refusing to say this work is better than that work, we reject elitism and dogmatism. We equate value judgments with assertions of power or subjective preference, and thus renounce them. But in doing so, we tacitly concede to consumer preference or market value as the only standard by which to judge works of art and disable ourselves from offering alternative values. Clune says we do have authority in value judgment, derived from our professional expertise, a set of skills developed through training and practice, teachable to students and confirmable by the profession. Clune writes that the most radical consequence of his approach to judgment is the principle that, quote, the right criteria for judging a work cannot be determined before the encounter with that work. To a certain extent, I understand him. He gives a wonderful description of what he calls the negative capability involved in judgment, a bracketing of our projections to discover the values the work itself discloses. But what goes into determining the value of those values? What leads the critic or teacher to select a work's values as more valuable than those of another work? To me, this is not a problem, but rather an opportunity to acknowledge a further complexity of judgment, the role of a subjectivity or sensibility deeper than mere consumer preference. But Clune swerves away from this by an enigmatic suggestion. He writes, in expert judgment, the subjectivity involved is in a meaningful but subtle sense a property of the object. I understand his point that values are immanent to the work and that a critic might discover them by bracketing his own projections. But after the values are discovered, isn't it the critic that chooses one work over another as worthy of admiration? For example, in today's talk, Clune implicitly judges Brown's valuing of street fighting as worth teaching and writing about. What is gained by not being explicit about it? How should we make a case for the works and values we value? In a related vein, I'm interested in the sharp distinction Clune makes in his book between aesthetic and moral values, expertise, and education in the humanities. He sees these as incompatible and says we must choose between them. He chooses the aesthetic, or as he puts it, artistic route. But his distinction rests on a notion of moral education as the rote inculcation of good moral attitudes, and of aesthetic education as totally separable from moral concerns. This doesn't jibe with my experience of great works of art as complex mixtures of aesthetic and moral thinking, as occasions for moral exploration, we might say. For example, a great novel, Middlemarch is the classic example, but also, say, a wicked book like Sabbath's Theater might offer insight into moral psychology through its handling of plot and character, through tone and style. To read it well is to grasp how its moral and aesthetic values are intertwined. Clune's own criticism, I think, displays this intertwining. His work is on the one hand animated by a set of aesthetic interests. He reveals a wonderfully strange cognitive territory, from the imagined music of Keats and Proust as a technique for stopping time, to Thomas Bernhard's invention of a novel that could escape the regime of social recognition it itself participates in. Clune is drawn to limit works that allow us to have thoughts undreamt of in other disciplines, to invoke Hamlet again. But it seems to me that these conceptual insights also have a moral valence, centering around something like a critique of moralism. With regard to today's paper, I want to ask, what is Clune's underlying moral point? Is he aiming to defamiliarize, to provoke, to challenge the liberal sociological politics of victimhood? Is he affirming Brown's Nietzschean defense of self-creative violence against critical versions of slave morality? To me, these insights might be part of a moral education, understood not as prescriptive, but as an adventure in moral thinking through art. I wonder if Clune's resistance to judging the value of artistic values and to artistic education as a mixture of the moral and the aesthetic derives from his stark opposition, the stark opposition he draws between expert judgment, which is fundamentally objective, and individual sensibility, which he characterizes as arbitrary, dogmatic, and elitist. In this spirit, he criticizes authors who portray judgment as a vocation rather than a skill. But isn't this a bit of ressentiment, a concession to the dogmatic equality he wants to free us from? What about Brown's aristocratic ethos of street fighting? A theory of judgment is impoverished if it doesn't leave room for sensibility, for individuality alongside expertise. We shouldn't be embarrassed by its elusiveness of definition. A standard of competence is crucial for the teaching of literature, but great critics are not only competent, they're original. We read them for what we can't get from anyone else. How does Clune's commitment to expertise square with the antinomianism of his canon and the uniqueness of his own criticism, and the achievement of identity or individuality as Brown's major goal? So I'll just summarize my questions quickly. How do we judge the value of values? Or how can we make a case for the works we value? Why can't the study of art be simultaneously aesthetic and moral education, or be a form of both? Must an account of expertise repudiate individual sensibility? Those are my sort of three major questions. And I think an overarching comment that I have is this. What I find lacking in Clune's account of judgment and value in the humanities is an acknowledgement of what this is all for. The answer I would give is something like the development of full human beings. That's what the study of values is really about, it seems to me. This is neither simply aesthetic nor moral, but an exposure to a wide range of human experiences and values as a means to a deeper life. Why can't we just say it? So, Michael, I'd love to hear your thoughts on those questions, and then we can open it up to Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Ben, for those questions, and for your generous reading of my work. I think I'll take the second question first. A little while ago, I published a piece which was taken by many to, and I tried to clarify it in a subsequent interview, but I'll try to do so again here. When I opposed aesthetic education and moral education, I was opposing a very particular kind of moral education, which is characterized by seeing literature as exemplary of moral values that we already know and we already hold. And the example I used was the well-known Octavia Butler's short story Bloodchild, in which many colleagues that I know that teach this work use it to exemplify the horrors of slavery. And what I point out in the piece is that if you read that piece, yes, it evokes the horrors of slavery, but it also constitutes this kind of surprising defense of the Second Amendment right to bear arms. You know what I mean? And it also has elements about how freedom is founded on the ability to commit suicide. Other elements that don't fit comfortably, that aren't amenable to serve as examples for the moral program the professor may wish to put across to the students. So I distinguish, I think that first form of moral education is incompatible with aesthetic education because it already knows what it's going to find in the book. And I also think this is very prevalent in literature classes today. I think it's.
Can I just interject very, very briefly? I guess my point is, I don't think that's an adequate definition of moral education. I think that what you're describing is moralism.
Yeah.
And actually bad teaching, because if you're really reading a book for its own values, you should be able to talk about the parts that don't fit in. So I think that's just it's too narrow a definition of moral education, and it throws it out the window when it could in fact embrace a more capacious understanding of it.
I understand people, and I actually wanted to use the term moralism, and my editor didn't like it for reasons that I think are good, which is there are versions of that kind of moral education which has been historically dominant, by the way. Plato advocates for it, you know what I mean? He's the first prominent philosopher to advocate for it. Many others have. I think there are strong cases to be made for it. I don't want to dismiss it. I just want to distinguish it from what I think we are doing, which is absolutely engaging moral questions, thinking morally, but not in that programmatic way. So I would totally accept what you say, Ben, in the sense that, as I try to do with Claude Brown, he's raising morally fraught issues in very interesting ways that I want to try to think about and evaluate morally. And I don't want to quibble about the term moral education. The reason I don't want to lay too much weight on it, and this gets to your question of what is the ultimate value of the humanities. And I don't like answers to that question because they seem totally vapid. They don't seem interesting. You know what I mean? Cultivate the whole human being and so forth. They just don't seem that interesting. And also, part of the project of aesthetic education seems to me we don't know where we're going to end up. And so I really try to be true to that in terms of saying, and I say this in the conclusion of my book, I'm not able to give you a kind of list that you could put on your brochure for your English department on the great things that the English that studying literature will do for you, make you a better person and so forth. Not because I don't believe it can do that, but because I believe all the things that it can do can't be specified in advance with encounters with particular works and particular traditions. Some people have suggested to me in responses that the negative capability I describe as integral to expertise comes with its own kind of moral goods, and that may be true. That may be true. I think there are certain kinds of humility and other kinds of interesting moral entailments to that. But I also think it's ultimately there's some bad moral. It can be much better to be not more negative capable. You can be a much better person if you already totally know what you believe and are convinced by it. So I don't want to put too much weight on that. The question you ask the first question you asked, which is related to this, which is, how does the professor make a case for the value of what that reader discovers in entering into the work with this kind of negative capability? I do believe you make a case for that. I absolutely think that's crucial. I think that it's a complex process, right? So to use the example of the Claude Brown paper that I just gave, I get interested in Claude Brown, right? I read him, and I soon discover the ways he's been read don't seem to me to be right, that he's doing this very interesting thing, and he's in fact thematizing judgment and violence in ways that I think are fascinating. My job is first to show what he's actually saying, which is very difficult. You know what I mean? Just doing that is incredibly difficult. That's a difficult skill. And then the next step is bringing it into relationship, demonstrating its value. And part of that I do in engagement with Orlando Patterson, Albert Murray, Tricia Rose, and other folks. So I certainly believe that we need to, that our work of judgment is making the case for the value of what we read. I also believe the way we do that is depends on the work. It depends on what contexts, what features, what dynamics of the work that will that seem to us value, how we amplify or represent or bring those into the open will differ. The strategies we'll use will differ depending on the different work. Sometimes it will engage us in interdisciplinary efforts of various kinds. And I've done that with neuroscientists and here with sociologists. Sometimes it will be purely literary, but we absolutely are involved in saying, this is what's valuable. But again, my emphasis is less on the raw statement, the raw attribution of value, and more on the process by which value is disclosed by revealing features. You see what I'm saying? In other words, I don't begin by saying Claude Brown's a great writer and so forth. It's rather, let's see what he's saying, let's put it in these contexts, and then my hope is that the originality and interest of this work will be available to others. Your last point about repudiating sensibility is a fair one. I hope I don't do that. I certainly don't mean to do that. I did think that and I don't think we necessarily lack for theories of sensibility in the history of our literary traditions. I think what we lack is a theory of literary and aesthetic expertise. That's what I think when I came to write my book, I felt there were no adequate models of the expertise relevant to the aesthetic educator. And using Michael Polanyi's very robust and fascinating theory of expertise, which I found the most salient for this enterprise, that was my main focus. But clearly, sensibility plays a large role in one's receptivity and one's interests, and in one's capacities and so forth. That just wasn't the main focus of my book. And I think there's been, from Emerson to there's so many great accounts of sensibility. I didn't think that was something I wanted to take on in that work. But you're very right to point it out as an absence.
Yeah, I just think you go so far in the book. You could embrace that as well. I think you make too tight an argument against it. I think you're too committed to a certain version of expertise to then to allow it in the door in a way. So I think, yeah, I was very, very impressed with much of what you say about expertise, and I thought Polanyi was great in your account of negative capability. And then the 3 chapters where you demonstrate the practice were also terrific. And yeah, I think it's another layer that could be added to it. So thanks so much for those responses. Why don't we go to Theo's question?
Okay, hi Michael. Thanks for your talk. I had a question. It's sort of a small, and then hopefully it's a bigger question together. The local question I had was if it's really right to say that the street fighting is aristocratic. At first I was like, yeah, I get it, I'm with you. But as I thought about it, there's no element of heredity or hereditary privilege involved in the street fighting culture. And that seems like an important piece of the whole concept of aristocracy. But, that's just a quibble. But I think it's maybe an interesting thing because I wondered if you are too quick to give up on the concept of egalitarianism. You don't totally give up on it because you kind of say like, we have a misplaced egalitarianism, which I like that concept. It's misplaced and maybe it could be better placed. It's like a decorating issue. But I'm wondering if there is a way that you might want to reclaim the possibility of distinction through combat, distinction through achievement. The concept of distinction itself, arguably does have a place within a democratic or even an egalitarian culture. And that's why I thought maybe it's not just a quibble. So that's my thought.
Yeah, that's a great question, Theo. Thank you. And regarding the aristocratic, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's no hereditary link, and that word choice may well be infelicitous in the way that you're describing. I was thinking, I suppose I was thinking of something like Nietzsche's accounts of and others' accounts of aristocratic, the values of aristocratic culture and the epic tradition also. But you're quite right. The word is a distraction. Your wider point about egalitarianism. So what I'm against, what I think is incompatible with aesthetic judgment is what I call dogmatic egalitarianism, which is the extension of the equality of the principle of the equality of persons to the equality of consumer preferences. That extension, I think, is deeply problematic and wrong, and I think it actually has anti-egalitarian tendencies. But it's part of market culture, right? I mean, part of it. This is why I've been so interested in going back to Karl Marx's rejection of the principle of equality in the Gotha program and elsewhere, in Capital and elsewhere, in which he just says, like, this is just a very basic component of market culture, right? It's very difficult in practice to separate out a commitment to equality because it always gets repurposed to prop up commercial culture and all of its inequities and distortions. And I think that's a fascinating position. I don't go all the way with that. I end up saying in my book that by rejecting dogmatic egalitarianism, we clear the way for a genuine equality of access to aesthetic education, right? So I think there's one version of egalitarianism that stands in front of another. With Claude Brown, and your question was sort of about, I think, going into Claude Brown's perspective. In his work, he ends up with a position that sort of, at the end of his book, he just sort of says, look, he's embracing the set of circumstances that made him who he is, and that made Turk who he is, and made Danny who he is. And he wants to hold those figures up as exemplary, right? As to preserve their fame and transmit their fame. And he sort of says that's sort of incompatible with any kind of model that is interested in the well-being of everyone. It's just not compatible with that, right? That structure is not compatible with it. It is one in which there are victors and there are losers. That's the ethos he creates. I think, and he embraces, I think there are ways to soften and modify the harshness of that in a variety of different ways. One is that the aesthetic, as the book records the transformation of a social set of actions into literary and aesthetic representations, we can have an aesthetics of winner takes all that is nevertheless is available to everyone and doesn't necessarily entail the kinds of actual sacrifices and violences that he records. And that might be one way to think about the triumph of rap. Rap's very similar values in the last 20 or 30 years. But I think ultimately, I think ultimately, you know, in his book, he does end up in a place in which, in forging the strongest, as he says, that entails that many fall by the wayside, right? I don't think, and I think it's we can ask whether he's necessarily embracing that, or whether he's just sort of saying this is the state of things, right? This is the conditions that produced me. This is the conditions that I'm writing about, right? But it's a serious question in his work, and I think it's morally, as I tried to show, I don't come down on one side or the other with it. I'm interested in the intensity with which he raises these moral questions, which have often, not exclusively, but often been muted in rap culture, which in many ways comes after him, and which he is in some ways, I think, prophetically evolving values and producing a defense of its values. So.
Okay, Michael, can we keep moving because we have several questions here. That's great. I think Charles, you had your hand up first.
Great, thank you so much. Charlie McNamara from Classics at Columbia. I want to return to this contrast between Murray and Brown that you mentioned at the beginning, and especially on this idea of heroism, because Murray explicitly lines up his idea of heroism with improvisation, specifically this kind of artistic spontaneity of the jazz musician. And this maybe dovetails actually with what you're saying now about rap culture. Because I'm wondering if Murray's kind of problem with violence, or how he sees violence differently from Brown, is that for Murray, that violence, would lack some kind of thoughtfulness or even a kind of like headiness that Murray sees in this kind of musical improvisation. And maybe that violence can't be an object of judgment, whereas something like musical improvisation can. And maybe Brown, would want to present like heroic violence as something that's not like an irrational event, and something that actually could be the object of judgment. So I guess kind of in sum, right, like how might we see Murray's identification explicitly of musical improvisation and heroism as relevant to these kinds of debates about, what is the value of, or the different categories of violence?
Thank you, Charles. And it's a great question. And I would just say that I'd answer it. I'll try to answer more quickly than my last response. First, I actually think Murray's account of improvisation would be his aesthetic values. I think he would like the improvisational energy, the dynamic energy of rap. I think he would also, I think if he had allowed himself to see it, I think he would have liked that quality in Brown's writing. And I think with Murray, the real interesting question is this amazing writer, this brilliant analyst of jazz and of literature. He was unable to see any of that in Brown because he saw it simply as the illustration of social scientific theses about the Black inner city, which he rightly, distrusted and disliked. But I don't think that's in the work. I actually think that when I think that what Brown was doing was so unexpected. It was so easy to read him in the terms that the dominant social science were offering that he was misread. And I think Murray was one of those who misread him. So I think that absolutely Murray would, his aesthetic values are not ultimately different. And I'm reminded in the chat that Murray uses the term aristocratic as a positive value term, which I think is relevant. Thanks to Aaron Cunyon for that. The last thing I'll say very quickly is I don't know if Charles Murray wrote about prize fighting, but fighting, boxing, right, and jazz had a very interesting relation. Miles Davis wrote that great album on Jack Johnson, the great boxer. I mean, there's a lot of closeness between jazz and boxing, as there is indeed between rap and boxing, also rap and basketball, which is often figured in quasi-violent terms in rap and so forth. So there's a lot, really interesting question. Thank you.
Great. Bob Gooding-Williams.
Yeah, I think you meant Albert Murray, not Charles Murray in your last.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
And just a quick throwback to my talk this morning. I think the problem of moralism that you were discussing with Ben is something that also becomes an issue for Du Bois. Comes out in various ways, but the issue is always is obviously kind of there. You might imagine the minute he begins to conceptualize art as propaganda. But those points aside, I wanted to begin with just a personal note. So between 1967 and 1969, I suppose my freshman and sophomore years in high school, I attended an all-white high school in Athens, Ohio, not all white, but predominantly white high school in Athens, Ohio, the home of Ohio University. And I actually remember reading Man Child in the Promised Land when either I was a junior or a senior, either a freshman or a sophomore in high school. I guess it came out in '65, and I'll come back to that in a second. And I also remember white classmates reading it. And I remember having the distinct impression that their take on the novel was very much the take that you attributed to Tom Wolfe, in terms of contrasting Tom Wolfe's response to, that is to say, it's read as emblematic, right? And then Murray and Ishmael Reed come along and say that's fake lore. So and I remember having the sense already, again, freshman or sophomore year, I don't remember exactly, in high school. I'm not sure if I had read Murray, or I'm not sure exactly what criticism I would have read, but I read the novel myself, and I remember very much having the sense that my white classmates were taking this novel up as emblematic. They were reading it as an account of what it meant to be Black, or what it meant to be Black and poor, and my sense was that it was, I don't know that I was sophisticated enough to kind of read it as a kind of reification of certain sociological projections of Black life, but I had intimations along those lines. Now my question, to close parentheses. So my question is really an invitation to you to kind of talk about the debate, say, between Murray and Wolfe, and in the context of that particular historical moment. As you began talking about the book, I went along to find out exactly. You might have mentioned it, and maybe I missed it, but I checked, and the book was published in 1965. That's the same year that the Moynihan Report is published, right? And all these debates about sociology that pathologizes poor Black people, or poor Black people living in cities or in the inner city, all of that is almost immediately, right, channeled through a very strong reaction. Some people would say a misreading, but a strong reaction to certain parts of the Moynihan Report, which since then has been time and again kind of read as itself emblematic of that kind of pathologizing tendency. So to come back, so with that in mind, I wonder and this is not just a question to you, but also I guess a question that bears on the larger themes of the conference. To what extent is judgment or aesthetic judgment itself subject to historical kind of constraint? And to make the question more specific, I'm inclined to say that it's, I mean, first of all, by the way, as someone who went on to become a Nietzsche scholar for a part of his career, I think, oh wow, I missed all that then. So I welcome your rereading and your invitation to reread the book. But it seems to me that it's hard for me to imagine the book gaining the reception that you invite then, given the context. And it's not uninteresting that it took 55 years, and then Rapp and Tricia Rose and Orlando Patterson and a huge sociological, and literary critical, criticism about Rapp for you then to come to revisit and to provide us in a kind of plausible way a different way of reading Brown's novel. But it's very difficult for me to imagine your reading having gotten any kind of a toehold even, at that time. So that's kind of a longish question, but again, if there's a question there, it's about historical context and the way in which historical context, places limits, not only what can be said or because there's so much dogma, there, and it just gets shouted down, but what can be heard, what can even be heard as prima facie plausible.
Thank you. That's a great question, and I appreciate it. And I also noticed a lot of resonances with your talk, including your interest in negative capability. But as to your question, I think you're absolutely right. I think that at the time, as you say, 1965, there was no other way to read this, right? It was immediately seen by both its celebrators and its detractors as exemplary, right? As exemplifying the Black condition, right? Which it clearly is not. I mean, and Murray is totally, his essay is really right as a critique of the white reception of that book in the 60s. What's remarkable to me is that, and this is not infrequent in literary history, where the achievement of a writer only becomes visible after a time has elapsed, after we've been supplied with the aesthetic concepts, with the aesthetic terms that can value it actually, right? And so then we see, it's almost like it's what Borges said, right? A work of art creates its own predecessors. Rapp in many ways allows us to see Brown as a precursor, a prophetic precursor of that. What would be interesting, what I do not know at all, is did early rappers read Man-Child in the Promised Land? You know what I mean? I mean, did this have another circulation outside the one that you described of it being assigned in schools, of it being taken up as exemplary and as exemplifying what Albert Murray calls the or of Black pathology, right? So yeah, I think you're right. We're inevitably constrained in our time. We can try to do better. We can try to read against dogma. We can try to and I talk a lot about it in my book, the kinds of skills that can enable us to identify features of a work for which we do not have adequate concepts. But ultimately, we know we're going to fail in many ways, and Claude Brown presents a really interesting case, to my mind, of a work that only becomes legible, that large aspects of it only become discernible sometime after it was written.
Thanks.
Great, and we have a question from Amanda.
Hi, let me put my hand down, hold on. Hi, thank you, Michael. I feel like my question is going to be, is likely going to be a little bit associative, because as I was sort of trying to formulate it, I realized it had some valences across a couple of the other questions. So you said during your talk that Claude Brown's book is a book that's haunted by anonymous death. and it seemed to me like a big portion of what you were saying that Claude Brown does in the book is find a different form of violence, right? Is to revalue a specific kind of violence in fighting that might somehow counter the threat of anonymous death. And so you had these two, you sort of set these two different, this sort of like dichotomy between the sort of like fighting culture and drug culture, where on the one hand, fighting culture was a sort of demonstrated a certain kind of individual strength that drug culture could not. And it seemed to me like, in a way, drug culture sort of functions as a kind of a system of market values, like relationships of strength are all contingent upon addicts' needs for heroin. And so that's how, so people gain their strength at the expense of others' weaknesses. Whereas in fighting, it's a kind of, it seems like at least in the way you cast it, it's like a kind of contest between two individuals. But in a way that also reminded me that your description of that reminded me a lot of Emerson's arguments in his essay on friendship, about the ways in which in order to develop in a full intellectual and rich way, you need to have these relationships in which you argue with your friends and you argue with others in a very intense way, and they push you to like a new circle. And that seems slightly different to me than this sort of like contest over strength and over, I guess this kind of gets to the question that Theo Davis was asking, the sort of like aristocratic portion of it, because it seems to me that a part of, and this is, I haven't read Claude Brown's book, so you can entirely correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like part of what happens in fighting is that you also come into contact with another person in a very different way than you do if the violence is directed by economic incentive in some way. So I guess this is sort of a roundabout way of asking you what you think the issue of what you think the value of the issue of choosing violence is. Like, why is it so important for Claude Brown that his characters choose violence as a way of, as some way of deterring anonymous death in a way, or as some way of combating the threat of anonymous death, and also just more broadly what it means to choose violence in the environment of, say, as you were saying, going to the South, like the mid-century South, and seeing the ways in which Jim Crow was affecting intra-Black relationships, and this sort of, and the general violence of the American system against Black bodies. I'm sort of wondering why, what revaluing violence in this particular way does. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Amanda. The first thing I would say is that Brown does not see the violence in the South as at all like the violence he's describing in Harlem. Right? It's very distinctive. It's a total, he condemns the kind of violence he sees in the South. And he constantly represents it as linked up with animality in all kinds of different ways, as dehumanizing. And of course, Jim Crow is right there, right? With all of that. The street violence, he also rejects the violence of the mid-60s and the mid-50s. He's really talking about the kind of violence that he saw in the 1940s, and in which, and you bring up Emerson, which is interesting because one of the interesting things that happens a number of times in the book is that he becomes close friends with someone after he fights them. You know, that's a not uncommon dynamic, that friendship and fighting are intertwined, and that he often becomes close friends with someone after he's fought them, and sometimes they'll beat him and sometimes he'll beat them. You know, it's sort of like it's the friendship can build differently on both of those kinds of outcomes, right? When I say choosing violence is complicated in the first part because he himself doesn't, as he grows up, he's not in a position, he's in a Heideggerian sense thrown into this situation where older people are saying, you need to fight. If you don't fight, I'm going to beat you up, basically. You know what I mean? His father says to him, you need to go out there and defend yourself and so forth. But once he started fighting, what he realized was, hey, I can get a name by fighting. This is the only way I can get a name in my environment. I can get famous, right? I can achieve distinction. And this is an ancient, this is glory, this is an ancient motive for fighting, for combat, right? Is to achieve glory, right? And so what's remarkable about the book is the values of fighting, the value of fighting culture, the values of engaging with it are not really that different from the values you can see in fighting that you can see in a variety of epic traditions, right? I mean, it's very, very similar. Fame, renown, you demonstrate your courage and so forth and so on. And he got a reputation, he got a sense of identity through that experience. And then there's another kind of twist, writing about fighting, right? Taking fighting as a both goal of writing, as a subject of writing, and most interestingly, from my perspective, writing as a space in which you evolve the values for judging violence, for discriminating between the empty violence of the heroin epidemic in the South and the violence he values in Harlem.
Well,
Oh,
sorry, Amanda, quick follow-up.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like the distinction is that is really about cultivating a judgment about violence. The violence isn't sort of a monolith in the sense that there's violence, and that in and of itself is bad, but instead that there are kinds of violence that create certain kinds of sets of relation that are different than the sort of white supremacist market value one. I think I'm particularly interested in what you're saying about writing about violence because this can just be a comment because I know we're tight on time, because it does remind me a lot of like rap battles, literally, like that rap battles are these sort of fighting spaces, and that a lot of, especially gangster rap, a lot of what rap talks about is violence and sort of the mythos of violence and becoming famous by talking about violence, but its actual connections to street and drug related violence can have become more and more tangential or more and more unknown, than maybe they were sort of like when gangster rap began. So yeah, now I'm just riffing, but yeah, that seems interesting.
Thank you.
Well, I think we have to stop there, but thanks, Michael, for a terrific talk and great discussion, and hope to see you all at 4 for Uday Mehta's talk, and feel free to stay on the Zoom or log back in. So thanks again.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks a lot, Ben.